Nodes are becoming all the rage in today's motion graphics scene. You have software like Fusion, Calvary, Houdini, Unreal, Redshift, and yes, even Cinema 4D now has a node material system built into it. So what are nodes and why are nodes being implemented in so many softwares? That's what we're going to learning about today, again, through the lens of the built-in Cinema 4D node material system. So let's go ahead and check it out. All right, so I just want to start out by just breaking down the scene we got here. So I got a physically based light, PBR light here. Now, if you remember, those lights are more physically accurate. They already have the area shadows added as well as that physically accurate fall off. I'm also using the physical renderer, and in the physical renderer settings, I'm going to be using the progressive sampler. The reason for that is if I go into my interactive render region here, I can easily update this light intensity or move it around, and I'm going to get in a second and a half that quick feedback. Okay, so this is going to be important when I start applying materials and adjust them. We can see that really snappy feedback. And I also made some changes to some of those subdivision settings just to speed things up. Okay, so let's go ahead and grab our node material. So if you go into the Create menu here, go to Materials, and you'll see a few materials here, and there's our node material. And we'll actually come back to these other materials very soon. But if I go to New Node Material, it'll create this node material here. If I double click, whoa, we have our node editor. Okay, now this is completely different from the standard material system. And if you forgot what that looks like, let's go to Create, Materials, Standard Material, double click that. Here we just have all of our channels listed out, and you dive into each one to reveal options. You load textures by going into these drop downs, and you kind of have to, if I add something like Sketch and Tune, or grab a cell shader, that loads that shader in. I got to dig down into this to adjust those settings there. Okay, so that's your standard material editor. Let me go ahead and delete that. Now the node system works with nodes. And if you've used Espresso before, it's utilizing that same concept where on the left of all of these nodes, you have the input nodes, and then on the right side, you have all the output nodes. Now you'll notice on this node right here, it has no output nodes because this is your final result, the final result of your material. So all the nodes in your node editor are going to end up plugging into this basic material that is going to then be applied to your object. Okay, so everything ends, the end of the road is this final material right here. So if I go ahead and apply this node material to this big sphere and say the floor here, you'll see what's going on there. And you'll see that my light's kind of blowing everything out. So let's go to the light, bring down that intensity just a little bit. You see with that progressive renderer, we see what that looks like really quickly, okay? So the one thing to note about the whole node system is it's based off of the PBR workflow, so physically based rendering concepts, especially the whole reflectance channel and reflectance layers. You'll see that the only two nodes we have is that final output node and a single diffuse layer that is just pumping in the diffuse color into this BSDF layer. So what is a BSDF layer? Well, BSDF stands for bidirectional scattering diffusion function, which is just a very technical term for saying that this shader is going to calculate physically based reflection scattering, okay? And that includes in the diffuse. So there's a concept you really have to wrap your head around as far as what a diffuse is in the physically based world. The diffuse channel is basically a reflection with 100% roughness. Every type of object has some amount of reflective property, and rougher objects like natural wood would disperse light a lot more and blur it out and scatter it than a shiny object, okay? So again, if you think of diffuse as your 100% rough reflection, that is giving you your surface material. And you can see that with this diffuse scattering, it's almost like we have GI enabled. Remember, GI allows us to have our light to scatter and bounce as it would be in real life. Now, if you compare this physically based diffuse scattering layer here to your color channel. So if I double click here to create a new standard material, again, this has your color channel, and in the reflectance, there's just default specular. Both of these channels are fake. Color is fake. Specular is just fake reflection. Okay, so if I add this default material to this tiny sphere, you're gonna see a very stark contrast with how these different channels work with light in the scene. You can see that with our color channel enabled, you can see how poorly a job it does at scattering the light realistically. There is no reflectance that is physically based going on in our default specular here. So I'm just gonna remove that, and I'm gonna turn off my color channel. So right now we have nothing, and this sphere is just black. But if I wanted to build up this material using the physically based reflectance workflow, basically what I would do is I would add a diffuse layer. And you'll see that this is now looking very similar to what we had as the result of our node material, okay? Because again, the node material is using these same reflectance layers that are physically based. Okay, so I think the color might be, a little grayer, so that might be the only difference right now. But if I bring that down, you should see, yep, these match pretty well because it's using that diffuse, which is scattering the light as a real object would in real life, okay? And since it's reflecting the environment around it, that's why the diffuse lives in the reflectance channel, okay? Because it's influenced by objects around it. Now, if I go and I want to add reflection, basically, I would go and add another reflectance layer, this time Beckman, and this is just going to be a shiny material. And I just got to remember to go under Fresnel and add in that dielectric to have that realistic reflection roll off or fall off. And you'll see this is basically like our shiny material there, but it's all inside the reflectance channel. And this is the physically based workflow and physically based reflection and reflectance workflow that you'd use to get the maximum amount of realistic light scattering and just realistic look to your render, okay? So this was built all inside of the standard material editor. Now, if I go to create material, new PBR material, you'll see that if I double click here, this is already set up by default to build in the diffuse in the reflectance layer, reflectance channel as a layer, and then it has that default reflection already added to it, okay? So once you understand what the PBR material workflow is set up in the reflectance channel by layering up layers of different diffuse and reflection, the node material system will make a lot more sense, okay? So let's go back into our node material here. And you'll see that basically, by default, we have our physically based diffuse layer, a BSDF layer, and we have one diffuse layer getting pumped into the diffuse of our end result material, okay? Now, what if we wanted to add another reflection layer, or reflectance layer, or BSDF layer as it's called in the nodal system, to add a reflection, okay, to have this look more like that shiny sphere that we added that extra layer of reflection to. And we can do this a couple of ways. The first way is we just add another input of that BSDF layer. It's just an empty one. So what we have to do is then pipe in another node. So we can go ahead and duplicate this current diffuse node by control clicking and dragging and selecting this node. So I'm going to select this node and control click and drag. Just like you would control click and drag to duplicate an object in the object manager, you can do the same thing with nodes. And what you could do is click on this diffuse, and you can see that you can change this BSDF type from diffuse, and you can change this to Beckman. Again, this is using the same reflection names or reflectance layer names as you would find in your reflection channel. So if you clicked add here, you see there's the same reflection layers, okay? Now that's one way to create diffuse material and then just pipe that in to that new BSDF layer. Change this one from diffuse to Beckman, load in that Fresnel dielectric. So same terminology there. We got our dielectric IOR, all these things we covered before, and the roughness, of course, okay? So all very similar things. So that's one way to create that new layer. I'm just gonna delete that, and I'm gonna go ahead and just go click on this BSDF layer that I just created and remove that. Now there's an easier way that allows you to create that extra BSDF layer without having to duplicate a node and then plug it in manually and all that stuff. If you don't click the add button, you go to this next menu here, you can actually feed in a new node. So if we go to surface, you can see here's a new BSDF surface. If we click that, you'll see here is the second node that's created. It's already plugged into that second BSDF layer. So it basically just automated creating that new empty BSDF layer and then created that new diffuse layer node or BSDF layer node and then plugged it automatically in. So again, I can go into this diffuse, go to Beckman, blur that out, add that for now. Okay. So basically these are two nodes that are the BSDF layers or those reflectance layers that are pumping in not only the diffuse color, but also the reflection. We have this nice shiny sphere right there. Okay. Now, what you're going to notice is on the left side here, if I set this back to default, is a whole bunch of folders. Okay. Now, these you can think of as you twirl these down, all of the different types of node effects that you can add to your whole node setup here. So you have stuff like colorize, you have, things like in the generators, you have ambient occlusion, you have cells, you have a checkerboard. So if you wanted to have checkerboard be your diffuse, you can bring in the result of that checkerboard, plug it into the diffuse color, and you'll see that now we have a checkerboard pumped into our diffuse channel versus just that white color. Okay. So a lot of easy things you can do. We have gradient. If we plug that in, drag and drop that in, you can see there's this, and you can choose individual colors for each of the knots, pump in that end result here. And you'll see that even if you click that gradient node, you can adjust this just like the gradient shader that you'd load up in the old material system or the standard material system here. Okay. So do something like that, and that'll just update, and that's plugged into the diffuse channel, and that'll show up there. Okay. So I'm just going to select that, delete. But you're going to see that there are a ton of these nodes, and there's actually over 150 nodes that come into the node system. And they're all, node effects that you can plug into your whole node editor. Now, this is kind of intimidating, of course, because 150 effects or nodes are a lot to keep track of to know what each one of them does. But I just want to remind you that if you use After Effects, you have how many effects in After Effects, and do you really need to know what every single one of them does? No. So it's kind of the same thing here as well. So you can see in the surface, we have the BSDF. We already learned that. We have bump map, displacement map, all this good stuff. And say if you wanted to just insert a color node, you can click on this assets tab here and bring up the search, and I can search for color, and you can just bring in a color node. And basically all the color node does is just outputs a color. So I can have that color in there and make this purple. And color node is just very basic. Okay. So I'll just go ahead and delete that. So yeah, all that to say is that it's easy to search for all of these things and build up a node. Now let's cover all of these other options here in this base end result material node. And if you want to navigate through your node editor here, you can use the same shortcut keys to navigate in here as you can in your actual viewport. So if you hold down the 1 key, you can pan, and if you hold down the 2 key, you can zoom in and out. You can also use this little gizmo down here to, if you have a big nodal setup, or you have a node all the way over here, you can actually see that down in here and focus on that one node and then go back to over here. You also can view and select all of your nodes here in this node area here. So you can quickly select from this list and adjust those values in each of those nodes. So a lot of cool UI stuff in the Cinema 4D node material system. Okay. So on this material output node, we have the 2 BSDF layers that we created. There is a mission, which you can think of as basically replacing luminance. We have alpha, which is also in our standard material. There's normal, displacement, and AOV, and the stuff we'll get into a little bit later on in this course. But you'll notice there's normal and displacement, but no bump, okay? And basically all the bumps will actually just get piped into the normal because there is no bump. If we go to our standard material here, you'll note that we have glow, there's fog and environment and diffusion and transparency. And you'll notice in the node editor, there are none of these things in this list. Now, if you click on the main end result material, there is transparent. And if you click that on, basically you enable transparency on this object, as you can see, but there is no environment or glow or anything like that. And the reason why that is glow and environment are ways to fake a look or fake an effect. And again, this is all physically based effects, and all that fake stuff does not fit into that physically. Now, the most obvious way to exhibit the benefits of using a nodal system is you can easily have nodes and connections built into other nodes, and you can have this big, huge nodal tree to really build up complex shaders. But I'm not going to show you how to build up a very complex shader. I'm going to show you how you could utilize one node to feed into different aspects. So let's just say I have my roughness here, my reflection, it's got some roughness, but as I showed before, if you want to really grunge up a reflection or make it more realistic, we can pump in a noise to control the level of intensity of roughness by using the black and white values in a noise, okay? So what I can do is if I want to search for noise, I can either search here by just, not noise, but noise, and just search for noise here. You'll see there's a few different types of noise that we can choose from, or in this little node editor view, I can hit C and that'll bring up our node commander, and I can search here as well. So let's just use just regular noise, and I'll plug that in here. And you'll see that this is very, let me just zoom out here. If I click on this noise node, you'll see it looks a lot like the noise shader that you can plug into the standard material system. So we can choose the noise type we want, something like maybe Luca, something like that. And you can adjust the contrast and all that good stuff. So this should all make a lot of sense. The noise node works a lot like a noise shader. So if I wanted to have this noise, the black and white values of this noise affect the roughness of our Beckman reflection, basically I would just connect the result or the actual noise and have that plug into the roughness, okay? And then what you'll see is now we are using that black and white noise grayscale noise values to determine the amount of roughness over our objects. You'll see certain parts of our object will be more reflective and others will be more rough, and we'll get this nice variance of roughness over our object. Now you can also plug this into the intensity, and if you want to disconnect from roughness, just double click on the wire. And now you'll just have that noise affecting the intensity of that reflection. So you'll get that a little bit of variance that way as well as far as the reflection strength across the surface of your object. So I actually liked this in the roughness. So I'll just click and drag to plug that into the roughness. Maybe go into this roughness channel, and you can see that now instead of that slider, we now have that noise shader controlling the roughness amount, okay? But we do have the ability to adjust the intensity, and we do have the ability to go into our noise and adjust the contrast. So again, anything that is a lighter value will have more roughness, and whatever is a darker value will have less roughness, okay? So it's just translating those grayscale values and applying that to our scene. Now, you'll notice I had to adjust the setting a few times for it to update. Sometimes that happens and the view just kind of gets stuck. So if you adjust the values, it should snap back to where it should be. So I'm liking that contrast. Now, one of the benefits of this node system is you can have a single node pipe in and affect different things, okay? So if I wanted this noise to also be the color or the diffuse color, I can plug that into the color channel. And not only is this going to use the noise for the reflection roughness, but it's also using it to pump into the diffuse channel. Okay, so now it's the color. Looks like a bowling ball almost, like from the 80s or something like that. I'm just gonna go and double click to disconnect that. But what if you wanted to then plug this noise into the normal? So we wanted to make this, kind of give this a bumpy surface. So I'm gonna plug in this result, click and drag, connect that to the normal. And you're gonna see this does not look right at all. So what's going on? Well, in node systems, and even in the old material system, to have a non-normal texture be converted to something that the normal channel could recognize, you would need to go into your texture menu and go into effects and go to normalizer. Now you can think of these effects as your node effects that we've been applying this whole time, but this is the effects and how you apply them in the old standard material system. So normalizer shader needs to be involved to convert a noise. If I load up noise here, to convert that noise into something this normal channel can use. Okay, without that normalizer shader, the normal channel doesn't know how to make sense of just a noise shader. Okay, and there's similar things like that in the node material system where just the noise is not going to be translated by this normal channel just by piping in the noise into the normal. We need that, basically that normalizer-ish kind of shader to convert grayscale values into something the normal channel can make sense of. And what we can use for that is, if I type in normal, you'll see there is a normal map and a bump map surface node effects. Now, we're not using a normal here. We're actually using what is a bump map. It's just a black and white map. So what we can do is we can drag and drop this bump map node into our node setup here and disconnect this result, disconnect this wire from the noise to the normal, and instead connect the result of the noise into the value of our bump map. You'll see this is going to convert it to a different type of image. So we had this, the bump map is converting it to this and basically doing what the normalizer shader did and converting it into the RGB values that make up a normal texture. And now if we export this result into the normal, you should see something a lot different than what we had before. Okay, so that's kind of the thing you need to understand about some of these effects like displacement and normals is sometimes you need to bring in a node that can convert something like a noise node or an image with grayscale values into something that the normal channel can then use. Okay, and that's where our bump map comes in handy. And if we had a normal texture, we'd then use this normal map instead of that bump map. Okay, remember a bump map is just a black and white value. And so it's just converting that black and white value to something the normal channel can use, since again, there's no bump channel here at all. So this is just gonna make this look a lot more realistic. And it looks really, really nice for being, again, that fake bump, okay? Now, what if we wanted to instead use this in displacement? So what I'm gonna do is delete this bump map. You're gonna see that now we're left with this wire connection to the normal. I'm just gonna double click that wire to remove that. And instead, I'm gonna use a displacement node. So displace, and you're gonna see there's a displacement map surface. So just like we needed the bump node to convert the grayscale values of the noise to something the normal could use, we need to do the same thing with the displacement. So I'm gonna pump in this noise result into the value, and then the result of that displacement node conversion, I'll plug into displacement, and there we go. Now you should see that update, and everything should be really pointy, as you can see, as our progressive renderer does its thing. And this doesn't look great at all, of course, because we need to go into displacement and turn on subpolygon displacement to smooth everything out. So it subdivides the geometry for us, and we have something looking a lot better. So not only do we have the noise node feeding in and adjusting the roughness, we also have it in the displacement through our displacement map node. What if we wanted to keep reutilizing this noise and say use it for emission? Now what emission is going to do is the darker areas of the grayscale noise will get very little luminance value or light emission value, and all the lighter size of the grayscale values will emit light. And this would be way easier to see if I just go ahead and apply just that PBR material to that background. So we can just have our little sphere here with the emission material applied to it. And you can see that wherever that white part of the noise is, basically the most displaced bit of that noise, you are going to have that part of your object contribute to the illumination of the scene. And you can see that being reflected on the floor there, even reflected on the sphere over here as well. And this is a really cool effect to be able to pump in a noise to an emission channel to have an object emit light like that and become a light source and contribute to the illumination of your scene. And again, this is happening without GI even on. In fact, GI does not work and is not compatible with the node system because it's basically using a form of GI with the light scattering using the BSDF layer. So you already get this really nice kind of GI light scattering for free. Not for free rendering wise, but for free. You don't have to add a post effect at all. Okay. So what if we wanted to take this a little bit further and say, you know what? I like using the emission, but I want to change the color of this noise and then pump in that results into the emission. So what you can do is you can actually bring in a colorize node, and instead of dragging and dropping it into the scene, basically all I want to do is kind of add it between this noise and that emission node. So I want to have it like be plopped right in the middle of this wire. So I'm going to right click on this wire, and we can actually insert a node in between the result of this noise node here and this end result material. So I can go into the insert converter, and I can see here that the colorize is under the color menu. So I'll go to insert converter and go into the color menu, and here are all my color related nodes, and there's colorize, and you'll see that boop, it just plopped that colorize effect and colorize node right between the result and the emission. So you can actually directly pump in a node into a wire and do things that way. So now we can totally remap the colors of this noise to something else. So if we wanted something like, let's emit like a pinkish purplish kind of color there, and you'll see that now we are emitting pink instead of just that white from the grayscale noise there. And we can adjust this color knot here, do something like that. And now you can kind of control it where, you know, we only have light, this pink emission coming from only the brightest areas of that noise. And you can see we're almost like clipping it as well. So like the very tips are getting displaced because we have not only the noise and the emission, but it's also driving the displacement. So the maximum displacement areas are also getting the very right hand side of this gradient, which is super, super cool. Maybe we'll plug in like a lighter knot right here and maybe change this to like a lighter pink. And you will see that that like kind of pink tips going on with that max displacement, those maximum displacement areas of this material. So since all of this is being driven by this single noise node, we can easily start changing this up and kind of iterating, which is really, really cool. So maybe we change this to multifractal, see what that looks like. We can also change this to maybe Voronoi, get something kind of interesting. So this is like the most obvious example of the power of a node material setup. This is something that if you wanted to do this within the old material system, you would have to, if I loaded up a noise in the color channel, or a noise in the color channel, not a color in the color channel, you'd have to, copy the shader, paste it into this reflection. You'd have to dig down in this roughness, paste it there. And then to link it all together, there's no way to do that unless you actually link it up with Espresso. And that's a much more laborious setup than just using the node material system. Because basically, if you try to do this with Espresso, you're kind of doing the node material setup the hard way, the hard manual way. Okay. So just that to say is that do not be afraid of the node system, because sometimes you only need to do something like this, and it's a very basic material setup. Now, if you wanted to get into more advanced materials and node materials, there are a bunch of node material presets that are basically authored materials that you can dig into. So there is car paint. You can go ahead and apply that. We can apply, let's do wood, and apply that to the little sphere. And then maybe we go to marble and use marble for the background cyc here. And you'll see that if we dig into, say, the car paint, we have that nice, standard material UI where all the nodes are kind of hidden from you, but we got the squircles. That's fun to say. And you can adjust the roughness. There's flakes, like the little metallic flakes that you can adjust here. And this was all programmed as a preset and authored by someone at Maxon. And you'll find that with a lot of third-party renderers like Redshift or Arnold that use nodal materials, and even Octane uses nodal materials, and then has this if you don't want to deal with nodes, you can just deal with this more simplified UI. You can build up, someone can make like very, very complex node shaders, and you can go ahead and, dig in and adjust all of these options here as well. So if you dig into the node editor here, you can see that there's all these little inputs that you can then, throw a noise in the roughness. You can, adjust all these different things. You can even pipe in a node to adjust the Fresnel and the base color, and all that kind of stuff. So, node materials, you only need to know so much to be proficient at it, and just know how to utilize some of the nodes, learn what some of the nodes do, and then just how a nodal material system works, like how to edit nodes at that point. So let's go ahead and jump into the wood. You can see what that looks like. You can see the veins of the wood, and you can adjust that. Dive into the node editor, and you can see all of the stuff that kind of goes into this. If you want to see, this is like the front end, this is what the user sees. But if you want to dive into what makes this possible, this kind of pared down front facing bit, if you want to peek behind the curtain of what's going on to get all these settings in place, you can go and click on a node, go to assets, and go to edit assets. And here's where you can start to peek behind the curtain and see all of these different types of things that were basically edited and created to be able to adjust all of these little values. So you can right click on one of these areas here, like the grain, right click, go to edit port. And you can see all of the different things that went into adjusting and creating that little port. I can't make sense of most of this. You can also right click, go to edit resource, and then you can see even more. And this just makes my brain kind of explode. But all this is to say is that smarter people than I can go in and program these procedural material, those procedural node materials. And at the end of the day, they make it to the point where this is all you see. Okay. Not all that other stuff. So we dig into the marble and see what that looks like. Let's actually see the material editor version of it. You can see we got the grain, we can adjust that. The different veins, we can adjust the color of those veins. So if we have the base color, something like dark, because purple marble is definitely something you see a ton, but I'm just trying to, make some contrast here. You can see the reflectance value. And let's make this progressively render this background a little bit. Really can't tell because of how grainy it is. But I'll also say that this is a nice front-facing setup where you don't have to deal with the nodes, okay? There is also, if you want to just do like a really quick basic material, there is this Uber material, which is always fun to say too. And let's apply this to the plane, and let's just do both of the spheres as well. And if I double click on that Uber material, you'll see that this is basically like a nice intro to nodes, but you're getting that front-facing UI that is very reminiscent of your typical standard material. Okay, this is your standard material. This is your node-based Uber material, and it has that same kind of user interface, okay? So the diffuse, you can pipe in your color. This is like your color channel, right? There's your reflection, and you can add less roughness, so it's even more kind of shiny. Let's make this a little bit darker here, a dark blue. And here is coding, which is basically just another level of reflectance, okay? So if we had a blurry reflection, remember we can add that clear coat to this whole setup. So we have the diffuse BSDF layer, then the reflection, and then another level of reflection that is shiny. So the blurry reflection layer and the coating, and this is how, like in a standard material UI, you can build up a node material without touching the nodes. There's the emission, there's transparency, bump, normal displacement, and if we go into the node editor, you can basically see that this Uber material has all of the familiar standard material settings, and all these inputs are already set up for you, and displacement and normal and all these things that we kind of did ourselves. They even added like a little bump. Now, the one last thing I want to leave you with is just to, explore all of these nodes in any renderer that you use. They all have their own unique node effects. So in Cinema 4D, one that's really interesting is if you go into the generators, go all the way down to scratches. I'm just going to drag and drop that in here. You can see that there are just a bunch of dots right now, but if I adjust the scale on this scratches node, you can see that basically this is a procedural scratch generator. So typically to get scratches, you need to, import your own texture image, like image texture. But here's just a really procedural shader effect or node effect that I can adjust the seed, and you can see that's just switching that up. You can adjust the thickness overall and the depth, all that good stuff. And then you can, plug this into, say, the intensity of the reflection. And it'll use the black and white values to control that. You can see that the scratches are really big, so we'll have to scale this back down for this to look nice at least. But it's really cool that that's a thing in the node effects system, okay? So play around, explore, and get a little familiar with the C4D node material system, because it should be able to be utilized by a lot of third-party renders, hopefully sometime in the future. So if you do learn a little bit about it, it's not like you're just wasting your brain power, okay? So hopefully your head doesn't hurt after learning a little bit about nodes. I know it could be a little bit overwhelming, but trust me, it's gonna be worthwhile to learn how nodes work, because you can't open up a piece of motion graphics software these days without having to deal with some sort of nodes. It's becoming more and more of a common thing, and there's no better time to learn about nodes than now. And I think once you wrap your head around nodes and really spend some time with them, I think you'll find that you wonder how you ever worked without nodes. So with that being said, we're gonna be using Redshift in this course, and it utilizes a node-based material system as well. So we're gonna have plenty of time to get used to them, learn a little bit about how that whole system works. So don't feel too stressed out if you don't understand it. We're gonna walk you through it, and it'll all start to make sense soon enough. I'll see you in the next video.